And after this, President Biden is expected to depart for Israel later today. He is expected to meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tomorrow, and then he'll jump over to Jordan to meet with King Abdullah and other Arab leaders. All of this comes as rocket fire is exchanged on both sides of the Gaza border. Israel's military is now weighing the next steps in its offensive against Hamas. An Israeli airstrike struck a residential building in the southern part of the Gaza Strip near its border with Egypt. This is the area where Israeli officials told Palestinian refugees to go to, you may remember, after fleeing the north ahead of what they said would be a ground invasion. Meanwhile, there is increased fighting between the IDF and Hezbollah militants. This is along Israel's northern border with Lebanon. Now, President Biden is traveling to Israel later today, as we've mentioned. NSC Coordinator for Strategic Communications John Kirby spoke to CBS Mornings about the goals for this trip.
The president believed that this was exactly the right time to go, to get an update from Israeli officials about how things are going on the ground, what their intentions are going forward, and also to talk to our regional partners about the need to make sure that we can get humanitarian assistance into Gaza and safe passage for people that want to get out of Gaza.
CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us now from the White House with more on this. Ed, we know the president has shown very vocal and support for Israel, but he also says he's committed to providing humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza. How might that duality complicate his discussions with Benjamin Netanyahu tomorrow?
Well, we'll see, but it's part of why he's making these two stops, first to Tel Aviv, then to Amman, Jordan, to meet with the leaders of Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority. The first stop, obviously, to reinforce the support that's been underway since the attacks occurred and to sort of amplify or step up the U.S. reaction and involvement. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, of course, has spent the last several days in the region and spent hours yesterday just off in meetings with the Netanyahu and his war cabinet, and then in an adjoining room trying to put the details of some of these arrangements together. So we'll see tomorrow to what extent this, ongoing conversation with the Israelis manifests into something more. But the fact that the Israelis have not launched any kind of an invasion amid the president's public pressure and the pressure from other world leaders to be concerned about and to ensure the safety and the humanitarian needs of those in Gaza is certainly notable.
I'm glad you pointed to that, Ed, because I was going to ask you about the fact that we haven't seen this ground invasion begin, even though it was announced last week, must speak to some influence President Biden has. Because in the background of this conflict, you have many folks in the world wondering if U.S. influence is waning. So let's talk about the president set to meet not just Netanyahu, but other leaders in the Middle East. As part of this visit, Arab leaders, King Abdullah, the Egyptian President el-Sisi. What kind of sway right now does the U.S. have with those nations?
Well, we'll see, because what is the ask right now of the United States? It's to certainly publicly support the plight of those in Gaza, but it may also ultimately be take some of these people in if need be. The issue for Jordan, especially for Egypt to some extent, is that there already is a refugee crisis given the Syrian war. They've already taken in millions of refugees and been assisting really since the Syrian conflict. So Jordan really may be at its wit's end and unable to absorb even more. If the United States and other world leaders, world powers step away from this and say, we'll give you the assistance needed, maybe that changes the calculus. But it's part of the reason why there's been resistance in Egypt and Jordan to taking them in and to putting pressure on Hamas to open up that Rafah gate and allow people out. Part of the other issue is you don't want to set the principle that they've left and can't get back, right? If all those people leave, or even some leave, it boosts the Israeli justification for taking over the area. The Arab world doesn't necessarily want that, or supporters of the Palestinian people who are living there don't necessarily want that, and so that will be a factor in all of this. There's huge risk for the president taking this, not only obvious security risk that something could happen while he's in the region, but the political risk, both at the global level and here domestically, that if he goes to Israel and Jordan and meets with all these leaders and walks away essentially empty-handed, or having them flouted what he was asking for and encouraging them to do, why did he make the trip? And therefore, when he comes home, what's the reaction for him possibly going over there and coming back with nothing, or seeing a conflict play out that was not to the way the United States hoped it would go. There's obviously no daylight between the U.S. and Israel on making it happen and responding in some way. The President has said aggressively and without delay. But if the concerns about civilians and the hostages and the humanitarian aspects aren't met, then that raises questions about how effective the trip will have been.
Well, Ed, I'm glad you mentioned the hostages, because that component seems to be what makes this conflict different than what we've seen in years past. The Biden administration says its top priority is retrieving the American hostages from Gaza, currently being held by Hamas. But how can the U.S. negotiate, in effect, with Hamas without undermining Israel's military operations and their own efforts to release hostages?
It's another reason that this whole thing has been complicated, and the reason why the Secretary of State has remained in the region, the reason why they've deployed a senior State Department official to work with the Israelis on hostage issues, why FBI personnel have been put in Israel to help figure out where they are and to possibly figure out how to get them back if that is a real option. We have seen, although we're not broadcasting, some propaganda video or some video of people believed to be held hostage released by Hamas. And so that's beginning to suggest that many of them may still be alive, even though they are in harm's way. And so if more of that surfaces here in the next few days, that's obviously going to up the pressure on everybody to resolve that issue. But you're right, that is an element of these kinds of conflicts, whether it's the ones back earlier this century or in 2014 that we haven't seen before. And remember, it's not just Americans that are being held. There are people from all sorts of countries around the world that got caught up in this. And so it's drawn even more global attention and concern to the conflict.
Yeah, none of us really know where this goes from here. But Ed O'Keefe, stay close. We'll need your insight throughout the day. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Let's get you to the region now. CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab, as you see on your screens, joins us now from Jerusalem. Imtiaz, we have reports now that a Hamas military commander was killed during an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. We know these airstrikes have been taking place daily, but it comes as these strikes also hit near the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. Just talk to us about the latest impact of these airstrikes.
Yeah, Errol, really the scale, the ferocity, the intensity of Israel's airstrikes across the Gaza Strip is really just shocking, quite frankly. I've covered previous wars between Israel and Hamas. 2014, of course, was one of the deadliest, in which 2,000 Palestinians were killed. Entire areas were leveled. But that was a 6-week conflict. We're here in day 10, and nearly 3,000 Palestinians have been killed. And the kind of devastation we're seeing is truly unlike anything we've seen before. And as you rightly point out, Israel has confirmed that they carried out strikes in southern Gaza, which killed, in their words, a Hamas leader. They say they carried out hundreds of strikes to kill this one leader. But one of that strikes was in the southern Rafah area, which of course is with the border crossing with Egypt. A CBS News crew was there when it happened. Our Palestinian correspondent, or rather our Gaza correspondent, Marwan Al-Ghul, was there and caught the aftermath of it. And the images are frankly horrifying. And it really just underscores the reality of the situation on the ground in Gaza, which is nowhere is safe. Errol.
It's a good reminder, Imtiaz. The Israeli airstrikes in Gaza have been taking place daily. We just haven't seen it up close because of the security situation there. In the background of all this, as we've been discussing so far, you've got the U.S. president heading to the region, focusing on getting humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israeli officials now say that this next phase of the war, which had been a full ground invasion, may not actually take place. You wonder if that's because of U.S. and international pressure. What are you hearing about that shift in strategy?
Yeah, it's a very complex picture. We have to remember that 10 days ago, a horrific attack took place inside Israel in which 1,300 Israelis lost their lives. We saw Hamas fighters killing people at a music festival, in kibbutzes, in communities all along the southern border. And it took the Israeli military several hours to even respond, and it took it days to actually finally contain the threat. Quite frankly, there was an intelligence lapse, there was a military lapse here. And so when Israel considers going inside Gaza, which is something they've only done twice before, once in 2009 and once in 2014, with very mixed results, going inside Gaza despite their enormous firepower, despite the sheer numbers that they have, and despite the resources Israel has, will not be easy. And the fear Israel has is that if they go in with force and are met with a kind of resistance that results in a high number of Israeli soldier casualties, and of course the deaths of those hostages who are being held there and who they want to retrieve, that this would be another blow to the Israeli military at a time in which it is really doing a lot of soul searching about its own performance, given those lapses that happened. And so there's a lot of thought being given here into that move, in saying that urgency is here as well. People here in Israel are angry. People here in Israel want to see something done. But the military, again, has a lot of thinking to do before it goes into Gaza.
That's right. All right. Imtiaz Tyab with that update for us from Jerusalem. Thank you.